Okay, let's get into it. We're doing a deep dive today on what, on paper, should have been a pretty standard global meeting, the G20 Summit in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Right. You hear G20, you think high level, maybe a bit bureaucratic, but generally predictable.
Exactly. But this was, the story hidden in our sources is just incredible. It's this spectacular collision.
A collision of what? Exactly.
Well, on one side, you have this really intense geopolitical friction. An almost unbelievable level of diplomatic pettiness.
Okay. And on the other?
Potentially world-changing proposals, really serious ideas aimed at tackling, structural global wealth inequality. The contrast is just fascinating.
It really was anything but a standard summit. I think it's hard to remember an event where the external drama was so starkly different from the substantive work being done inside.
So that's our mission for you today. We want to cut through the noise of that diplomatic fight.
Right. We need to extract the core political crisis around the U.S. boycott, first of all, then understand South Africa's critical continent-wide agenda as the first ever African host.
And then, and this is the big one, really analyze the seismic economic proposals that came out of the meeting. There's data in here that you need to be aware of.
Absolutely. So let's set the scene. Before we get into the fight, what exactly is the G20? Why does this particular meeting matter so much?
Good place to start.
Well, the G20, or the Group of 20, it was founded back in 1999. It came about specifically after the Asian financial crisis.
Because the G7 was seen as, what, too small? Too exclusive?
Exactly that. The idea was to create a broader forum. The G20 brings together the world's 19 largest economies, plus the European Union. All told, you're talking about roughly 80% of global GDP.
So this is where the big decisions are supposed to be made.
It's where global economic policy is supposed to be forged, yes. Finding common positions on finance, economics, major crises. That's the goal.
And speaking of forging policy, the tone for this meeting was set long before anyone even arrived in Johannesburg. Your sources describe the run-up as, and I'm quoting here, marred by a host's simmering row with the U.S.
Simmering is a good word for it. It was tense from day one. The core of the conflict was that the Trump administration announced it would boycott the official talks.
Which just throws the whole diplomatic rhythm into chaos.
Complete chaos. And the flashpoint, the thing that really lit the flows, was the ceremonial handover of the G20 presidency, which rotates annually.
And I think the level of detail here is so crucial for understanding diplomatic signaling. South Africa's objection wasn't just, that the U.S. didn't send the president.
No, not at all.
They objected to the U.S. plan to send a junior embassy official to take part in that key closing ceremony. It turned a symbol of continuity into a major, major incident.
That's absolutely right. The South African Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Crispin Fury, he made it unequivocally clear. His exact words were, "President will not be handing over to a junior embassy official."
That's not subtle. That is a clear refusal to accept what they saw as a deliberate slight.
An insult to their standing as the first African host of the G20.
So let's dig into that. Why the boycott? What was the official U.S. rationale for freezing out the first G20 ever hosted on the African continent?
It just seems so politically self-defeating on the surface.
Well, the sources detail these dual tensions that had been boiling over for months. It wasn't just one thing.
Okay, so what was the first one?
On the geopolitical front, the U.S. had proposed a major deal to end Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The problem was they structured the entire agreement without consulting Ukraine or the EU.
Without the main parties involved.
Yes, and that was already fueling this global friction about U.S. unilateralism, this idea of them going it alone.
And the second tension, as I understand it, was even more specific and, frankly, politically charged for South Africa itself.
Much more so. For months, the U.S. had been publicly accusing South Africa of racial discrimination against the minority white Afrikaners.
The group that ruled the country during apartheid. The very same. And South Africa, as the source says, vehemently rejected this accusation. To really get this, you have to understand that in post-apartheid South Africa, an accusation of state-sanctioned racial discrimination, it carries an extreme historical and political weight.
It sounds like an external power poking at a very, very sensitive internal wound.
That's a perfect way to put it. So you have this incendiary mix of, external geopolitical meddling with these highly sensitive internal politics.
It's no wonder, then, that the South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa, reacted so strongly.
Oh, he was definitely ready for a fight. He'd previously stressed that countries should not be bullied and that their sovereignty must be respected. He was laying the groundwork.
And he even floated that dramatic idea of handing the G20 presidency to an empty chair.
He did, which would have been an incredible diplomatic statement, though he did make a point of saying, and this is interesting, that he would have preferred to give it directly to Donald Trump.
That's a fascinating detail. Why mention Trump specifically? What's the signal there?
It connects directly to the logistics of the next summit. The U.S. is scheduled to host the 2026 G20 at the Trump National Doral Miami Golf Resort.
Ah,
So Ramaphosa was essentially signaling that his frustration wasn't necessarily with the U.S. as a country, but with the current administration's diplomatic style. He was looking ahead, recognizing that the presidency would eventually land with the next U.S. government.
but the public sparring didn't stop there. I remember Ramaphosa tried to smooth things over a bit, claiming the U.S. had changed its mind.
He did. He said they were actively discussing U.S. involvement. And that just brought the sharpest, most public rebuttal you can imagine.
From the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt.
Yes, she publicly contradicted him, said flat out the U.S. was not participating in official talks, and then she specifically called out Ramaphosa's claims as falsely claiming U.S. involvement.
And then added that his language is not appreciated. I mean, in diplomatic speak, that is incredibly harsh.
It's about as blunt as it gets. And just to make the level of the snub crystal clear, you have to remember the U.S. doesn't even have a formal ambassador in Pretoria right now.
Right. So the person they intended to send for the handover was the acting ambassador, Mark Dillard.
Correct. And for listeners who might not be familiar with diplomatic roles, he's a chargé d'affaires. That means he's basically running the embassy until a Senate-confirmed ambassador is appointed.
So sending him to an event of this magnitude is...
It's the highest possible level of snub you can deliver without, completely breaking ties or just skipping the event entirely. It signals pure, minimal protocol. Leavitt confirmed Dillard was only there to recognize that the United States will be the host in 2026. Nothing more.
It's just a remarkable amount of diplomatic theater. But if we pull back from the drama, the analyst community seemed to think this whole standoff actually harmed the U.S.'s standing more than South Africa's.
That was the general consensus, yes.
But hold on, isn't that a bit optimistic for Pretoria? I mean, the U.S. still holds immense global economic leverage. How could the U.S. be the ultimate loser here?
That's a very fair challenge. The argument from analysts like Marisa Lorenzo, it was less about immediate economic damage and more about reputational damage, especially in the global south.
Okay, so it's a soft power argument.
Exactly. She argued that the U.S., by linking a major economic summit to these very sensitive, racially charged domestic South African issues, just looked completely misguided. In her view, the U.S. came across as the unreasonable one.
So it fed into an existing narrative.
It confirmed the narrative that established global powers are increasingly petulant and self-absorbed, and that ultimately undermines U.S. soft power and its ability to build global consensus on other issues.
That sets the perfect stage for what South Africa did next, which was to pivot hard to substance. Despite all this diplomatic drama, they took immense pride in being the first African country to preside over the G20.
And they really leveraged that platform. They turned their host status into a mandate to champion issues vital to the entire continent.
They successfully used their year leading the G20 to push this highly detailed, very specific African agenda. They made sure regional priorities weren't just drowned out by the political feuds in Washington.
Absolutely.
This is a crucial section. We should spend some time on this. What were the top priorities that they actually managed to push onto the global economic agenda?
They focused on 4 main structural issues, big ones that affect the global south profoundly.
Okay, what's number 1?
First, addressing the crippling high levels of public debt across Africa. For so many African nations, debt servicing costs are just suffocating their domestic budgets for health, for education.
So this wasn't just about asking for debt forgiveness.
No, it was much bigger. It was about reforming the international financing structures themselves.
Okay. And the second point connects directly to the global shift towards clean energy, right?
Mm-hmm.
This gives Africa a new source of leverage.
Exactly. The second priority was ensuring maximum benefit for African nations from the growing global demand for critical minerals.
For our listeners, what exactly are critical minerals?
We're talking about things like cobalt, lithium, rare earth elements, the raw materials that are absolutely essential for batteries, for electric vehicles, for all modern green technologies.
And these are abundant in Africa.
Very abundant. So South Africa's agenda was to shift the whole relationship. The goal is for these nations to not just be selling cheap raw materials, but to develop manufacturing and processing capabilities at home.
So they can capture more of that value chain.
Capture more of the value, create higher skilled jobs. It's a smart long-term strategy, connecting natural resources directly to industrialization.
Makes sense. What was the third point?
Third, they aim to increase financing for what they called a just energy transition. And that's not just a catchphrase. It's a very specific concept.
What does it mean in practice?
It means moving away from high-carbon fossil fuels, but doing it in a way that preserves the economic livelihoods for the communities that depend on those industries.
So the argument is that rich countries can't just mandate a switch if it costs developing nations jobs and stability.
Precisely. The financing has to be substantial enough to ensure a just outcome for everyone involved, not just a green one.
And finally, they focused on disaster resilience.
Yes, improving disaster resilience and responses, which, given the accelerating impacts of climate change across the continent, is a rapidly growing need.
So those 4 points together, debt, minerals, energy transition, and resilience, it really represents a fundamental call for reform in how global finance interacts with Africa.
It's a complete rethinking of the relationship.
And we have to acknowledge, while Ramaphosa and his team were advocating for these massive global reforms, they were also hosting this summit while dealing with some very serious domestic issues at the same time.
That's such a critical reminder of the complexity of governance. The sources noted that protests over the epidemic of violence against women were intentionally timed to coincide with the G20.
A domestic outcry that was meant to capture international attention.
Yes. And the specific detail in the source material provides a truly chilling number.
It really does.
It noted that thousands of people lay down for 15 minutes of silence in memory of the average of 15 women murdered every single day in the country.
15 a day. That is just a stark and painful reminder that behind all the high-level economic diplomacy, there are these profound social challenges that demand urgent attention.
A very powerful juxtaposition.
Okay, let's transition now. We've covered the political heat and the African agenda. Let's get to what might be the main event in terms of structural economic proposals. Ramaphosa commissioned a set of reports, with one specifically zeroing in on global inequality.
And the second report, this is the one that contained data that really should shock everyone.
This is the work that has the potential to fundamentally shift global policy debates for years to come.
It really does. The Inequality Report was produced by a panel of independent experts led by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz. They synthesized data covering nearly a quarter century, from the year 2000 to 2024.
A huge data set. So what did that 24-year look back actually reveal about how wealth is being generated and distributed across the globe?
It revealed an extreme and an accelerating concentration of wealth. The report cited data showing that the world's wealthiest 1%, they captured a staggering 41% of all wealth generated across the globe during that period.
Wait, say that again, 41%.
41%, going to the top 1%. That ratio alone is just mind-boggling.
So let's contrast that. What about the other end of the spectrum?
Well, now you contrast that staggering figure with the bottom half of the global population, the poorest 50%. That half of humanity received just 1% of that same generated wealth.
1%.
1%. The magnitude of that disparity, 41% versus 1%. It's the clearest statistical evidence you could possibly have that the current economic systems are profoundly failing half the world.
That kind of data is a clear mandate for structural reform. And the Stiglitz panel, they didn't just deliver data. They delivered a concrete policy proposal aimed at tackling this problem head-on.
They did. Their central recommendation was the formation of an independent global body.
Okay, what would this body do?
It would be tasked with synthesizing all the data and research on inequality, and then, crucially, objectively assessing the effectiveness of policies that are designed to tackle it.
And they compared its potential structure to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Why is that comparison so politically significant?
It's crucial because it's an attempt to reframe the entire issue. For decades, inequality has often been treated as, a moral or political issue, something subject to partisan debate.
But by comparing it to the IPCC...
By comparing it to the IPCC, the panel is saying, no, inequality is a structural, scientific, and existential crisis, just like climate change. It requires a global, objective, non-political mandate to just define the facts and evaluate the solutions.
It shifts inequality from a question of ethics to a question of economic survival.
Precisely. And this proposal, it immediately got significant political weight, despite all the drama with the U.S.
Who came out in support of it?
It was immediately and publicly supported by Ramaphosa himself, by Brazil's president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, and by Spain's prime minister, Pedro Sánchez. They even co-authored an opinion piece endorsing its creation.
So you have immediate political buy-in from major players in both developing and the developed worlds.
A very powerful coalition right out of the gate.
And this is where the analysis gets really sharp for me. A panel member, Jyoti Ghosh, an economics professor, she highlighted the true danger of this wealth gap. Why did she say wealth inequality is even possibly the biggest problem, even bigger than income inequality?
Because wealth isn't just about spending power. As she put it, wealth inequality generates also greater inequality of power.
So wealth buys political influence.
It buys political access, it influences regulation, it shapes media narratives, and it dictates who even gets to sit at the table when global policy is being made.
I see.
So when 41% of new wealth goes to the top 1%, that 1% is effectively buying a vastly disproportionate share of global political power. And that power then reinforces the very economic structures that allow them to accumulate the wealth in the first place.
It's a self-perpetuating cycle of concentration.
A vicious one. And the solution, according to another panel member, Winnie Byanyima, the executive director of UNAIDS, it doesn't even require getting consensus from the entire G20.
Especially not from the U.S., which was actively boycotting the whole thing.
And that right there is the ultimate statement on the future of global governance. She emphasized that this monitoring body could be formed without a formal G20 resolution. She just said, simply, it doesn't have to start with a consensus. It can start with those who want to take it forward.
That is a huge statement. It signals a willingness by a coalition of nations to just bypass obstructionists and forge ahead.
Forge ahead with a crucial reform agenda, regardless of whether they have unanimous G20 support or not.
So let's bring this all together. What does this mean for us? We've seen a summit that was really defined by two extremes. On one hand, extreme geopolitical pettiness with the boycott drama.
And on the other, running in parallel, proposals for extreme global reform, specifically this inequality monitoring body.
It feels like a defining snapshot of multilateralism in the 21st century.
I think so. South Africa successfully used its host status to force issues critical to the global South debt, critical minerals, just energy transition right onto the main agenda. And we saw the fundamental data reiterated.
The wealthiest 1% capturing 41% of new wealth, while the bottom half of humanity gets just 1%. The need for action is just, it's undeniable. And for me, the defining moment was the political feud itself. The willingness of a G20 host to publicly clash with one of the world's most powerful economies over a matter of diplomatic respect, and then effectively turn around and say, you know what? We don't even need your consensus to fix the world's biggest problems.
And this raises an important final question for you, the listener, to really consider, building directly on everything we've talked about.
Okay.
Given this deep conflict over multilateral engagement epitomized by the U.S. boycott and that clear statement from the Stiglitz panel that the inequality body could proceed without G20 consensus, what does this G20 event really suggest about the future of global governance?
That's a great question.
Are the world's biggest, most complex problems now going to be tackled by coalitions of the willing, where reform-minded nations just move forward together, rather than waiting for this mandatory, unanimous agreement from every single one of the world's largest economic powers?
That is a fascinating thought to end on. The idea that the great powers might be retreating into their own dramas, but the reform agenda just moving forward regardless. We've certainly extracted the essential drama and the essential data from this deep dive.
Absolutely. The tension between global cooperation and national self-interest is only getting sharper. And South Africa just showed the world one way to navigate it.
Thanks for guiding us through this incredibly volatile summit.